The vanishing of Dr. Maryanne Holt in 1981. A young doctor vanished during an overnight shift at St. Armand Medical Center. 16 years later, in 1997, a demolition crew dismantling the hospital's long-abandoned morgue opened a sealed drawer. What they uncovered, wrapped in decayed linen, reignited a case the city had quietly buried, a truth it was never meant to uncover. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the air around St. Armand Memorial Hospital thick with the scent of wet concrete and sawdust. The building, silent for over a decade, now groaned under the vibration of machinery and boots. Once Seattle's busiest trauma center, it was now a skeleton of concrete slabs, broken glass, and faded blue signage. Contractors had spent the last week gutting the east wing, tearing out decades of neglect in preparation for a commercial complex that would eventually erase the past. Inside the morgue, two men worked in rhythm. Thomas Frick, a foreman with a quick temper and a protective streak toward his younger workers, stood over a rusted bank of body drawers along the far wall. Most of the units groaned open easily, their insides empty except for decades-old rust flakes and the occasional brittle glove. They were halfway through the third row when one drawer refused to move, probably warped from the moisture, said the younger worker, Nate, yanking at the handle again. "No, this one's caught on something," Thomas muttered, eyeing the drawer's frame. "Back up, I'll get a pry bar." He wedged the tool under the lip, bracing his foot against the base. With a metallic shriek, the drawer jolted open, and both men recoiled. Inside lay a partially intact human body, the linen stained and brittle. With time, strands of hair clung to the decomposed skull. A faint scent of rot, muted by decades but unmistakable, spread across the tile floor. Nate stumbled back toward the doorway. Jesus, that wasn't supposed to be there. Thomas reached for his radio with a grim expression. "Call it in." "Nobody touches a damn thing." Within the hour, the building was locked down. Seattle PD dispatched uniformed officers to secure the perimeter, followed by a crime scene unit and a temporary lighting crew. What was supposed to be a routine teardown had become a historical crime scene overnight. The remains were curled tightly in the rear of the drawer, knees drawn up to the chest as if folded purposefully. There were no signs of restraint, no rope. Burns, no chains. The linens wrapped around the figure bore a faded hospital insignia, nearly illegible from decades of moisture damage. The body's condition was described by one of the crime techs as intermediate decomposition with partial mummification, a rare occurrence, but plausible given the drawer's sealed state and low ventilation. There was no wallet, no badge, no medical ID, just remnants of a lab coat sleeve near the left humerus and fibers matching polyester scrubs. Technicians lifted what little material remained carefully into preservation containers. Nothing indicated violence. Not at first glance. One officer, trying to lighten the tension, joked it was an old cadaver left behind. No one laughed. Detective Sarah Whitmore arrived just after sunset, her coat unbuttoned and damp from the walk between barricades. Cold cases weren't usually her territory, but she'd earned a reputation for methodical work and unnerving attention to detail traits. Her captain respected and most of her colleagues resented. She walked the perimeter first, taking in the building structure, the gutted hallways, the missing ceiling tiles, and long-abandoned equipment. When she finally reached the morgue, she paused at the threshold and scanned the room before approaching. The drawer, sealed in, one of the crime scene officers noted. Nobody noticed until today. Sarah leaned over the open drawer, frowning. "And it didn't smell before?" "Only faintly," the officer said. "Room's been sealed tight. Plus the drawer's probably airtight. Mold and age soaked up most of the organic decay." Sarah nodded once and knelt beside the tray, examining the condition of the bones. "Any chance this was medical storage? A cadaver for teaching?" "No documentation supports it," the technician answered. "And it wasn't tagged?" Her eyes moved across the weathered linen, her brow tightening. If this was an accident, why seal it and forget it? The body was transported to the county medical examiner's office that night. The cold room buzzed with quiet energy as Dr. Ellison, a longtime forensic pathologist with dry wit and sharp instincts, took the lead. Sarah stayed for the autopsy, leaning against the back wall with her arms folded, observing the process with a stillness that made others uneasy. "Female," Ellison announced, brushing away degraded fabric. "Late 20s to early 30s, possibly. Caucasian. Condition is advanced, but stable enough for marrow sampling." He removed a portion of femur and pelvis, extracting a core for toxicological testing. No overt trauma, no fractures, no stab or bullet wounds. "But I'll need histology for anything soft tissue related." "What's left of it anyway?" Sarah studied the fragments of uniform fabric. "What's that made of?" "Polycotton blend," one of the techs replied. "Standard for hospital. Scrubs in the 70s and 80s, possibly a medical professional." Sarah's eyes lingered on the face, or what remained of it. "Get me a list," she said quietly. "Any female hospital staff who went missing around the time this place was still running." By the following morning, Sarah was parked inside the city archives building, poring over carbon-copied ledgers and scan-quality blueprints on microfilm. St. Armand Memorial's morgue logs, stored since 1985, were a mess of handwritten signatures, redacted entries, and unexplained gaps. She flagged a specific record from late '85. The drawer in question was listed as cleared, hazard exposed. No name, no asset ID, no final body tag. The signature approving the clearance belonged to Everett Mallory, a name that matched. No current hospital employment records. Sarah lifted the sheet closer. The ink had faded, but the signature stood out looped, practiced, with a confident downward hook on the Y, a red flag. Bureaucratic but telling. If this had been a cadaver, stored for training, it would have been listed with formal paperwork. If it were a patient, there'd be a chart. But this drawer had been scrubbed from the system. She made copies and added the former morgue supervisor, Everett Mallory's name, to a fresh list titled simply Involved Personnel. 2 days later, a call came in from the forensic lab. The dental impressions, matched against old medical licensing records, had hit a match. Dr. Maryanne Holt, the technician confirmed. Graduated 1977, residency completed at St. Armand in 1980. Disappeared July 1981. Sarah sat with the file open on her lap. The photo on Maryanne's license showed a bright-eyed woman in her late 20s, her smile confident, hair neat beneath. A white coat. She looked every bit the kind of doctor who stayed late, spoke with precision, and remembered every patient by name. Sarah turned the photo around and looked at the eyes again. "I'll make sure they pay." Sarah stood at the long wooden table in the records review room, flipping through a bound volume of 1981 shift logs for St. Armand Medical Center. The pages were stiff from age and moisture, and more than a few entries had been water-stained into illegibility. Still, Maryanne Holt's name appeared on 3 shifts in late June, all marked with the same blue ink and a steady, even hand. June 27th, 6 p.m., Holt M., a night shift. June 28th, 6 p.m., Holt M., ER night shift. June 29th, 6 p.m., Holt M., a night shift. No sign out recorded. Sarah ran her finger down the line of that final entry. No exit signature, no notations in the adjoining columns for incidents or relief coverage, just blank space, like someone had walked off the page. According to administrative documents from the time, Maryanne had never been flagged as a missing person. Sarah cross-checked the Seattle PD intake logs from that summer. No report filed under her name, not even a welfare check request. How? "Does a doctor vanish during a shift?" she muttered to herself. "And no one raises hell?" She flipped back to the HR binder she'd borrowed from the city archive. In one internal memo dated July 10, 1981, Human Resources had recorded her status as on leave, unresponsive to follow-ups. A post-it note affixed to the corner read, simply, possible voluntary departure. Sarah returned to the precinct with a copy of the memo, unable to shake the image of Maryanne's body curled in that drawer. Voluntary departure didn't square with the sealed morgue unit and a fake hazard label. Walk through the 1981 St. Armand housing records led her to Maryanne's last known residence, a modest two-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, she tracked. Down the current occupant, a retired accountant named Mr. Foley, who had moved in during the mid-'80s. He didn't remember much about the woman before him, only that he'd taken over the lease quickly after the unit had sat vacant for a few months. The landlord at the time, now deceased, had left behind a box of tenant files. In it, Sarah found a formal lease cancellation letter dated August 12, 1981, submitted and signed not by Maryanne, but by the hospital's HR department. They had cleared out her apartment. No evidence of a search, no contact with law enforcement. A doctor disappears mid-shift, and the institution simply moves her things and marks her as gone. Sarah sat quietly in her car afterward, watching the late afternoon traffic pass on Pike Street. Her gut said it wasn't just apathy. It was a cover dot. She arranged interviews with former St. Armand staff, still alive and reachable. 2 nurses, both retired and living outside the city, agreed to speak. The first, Ellen Dries, met Sarah at a quiet diner on the east side. Ellen was in her 70s now, sharp-witted and practical. She stirred her coffee slowly before answering. Maryanne, God, she was something. Always had charts in her hand, always. Following up. Sweet to patients, not so sweet to doctors who cut corners. Sarah leaned in slightly. Did she seem unstable? Burned out? Ellen raised a gray eyebrow. No, she was just intense, like she was carrying more than she let on. Did she talk about anyone giving her trouble? Ellen took a sip of her drink, then nodded. Breyer, she didn't trust him. Said his patients weren't getting the care they were promised. Said she didn't like the way things were being handled in internal. The second nurse, Judith Spence, lived in a retirement community north of Tacoma. Her memory was cloudier, but she recalled one thing clearly. A hushed conversation in the break room where Maryanne had told someone, if they think I'm letting this go, they're wrong. Judith didn't know who they were, but she remembered Maryanne's voice low, firm, and scared. Back at the precinct, Sarah put in a request for any security footage that might have survived from 1981. The odds were slim. Records that old were usually lost to degradation or recycling. But St. Armand had archived some old reels, part of a now-defunct liability policy. A single VHS tape labeled A West Corridor June 29, 81 arrived from archives. When played, it showed a flickering black and white view of a hallway just outside the nurse's station. Maryanne entered at 6:03 p.m., adjusting her stethoscope and greeting someone off-screen. That was the last they saw of her. The tape ran for 6 more hours. She never exited. No footage from the morgue level was retained. According to internal memos, those cameras had been disconnected weeks earlier for renovation wiring repairs that were never logged as completed. Sarah pulled the nurse's log again. Maryanne had signed in at 6 p.m. There was no sign out. Her name simply disappeared, and so did her notes. None of her patient charts from that evening remained in the hospital's official records. It was as though her last shift had been scrubbed. Sarah's next stop was the financial history of St. Armand. From 1979 to 1985, the hospital reported inconsistent revenue and steadily declining patient numbers. Their internal memos referenced deferred maintenance, furloughs, and auxiliary research partnerships. A series of grants from pharmaceutical companies had floated the internal medicine department during those years, particularly under the direction of Dr. Samuel Breyer. Sarah found records of fund transfers, marked for pilot study development and pharmacological data collection. No patient names, no study protocols, just vague references and accounting shells. Breyer's name appeared on most of the documents. Sarah made a separate note. He'd been mentioned twice now, once by the nurse, once in funding logs. He'd been chief of internal medicine the year Maryanne disappeared, the year those strange payments began. And now he was retired, quietly living out his days in a gated community on the far end of Queen Anne Hill. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment, surrounded by a small forest of open folders. On her laptop, Maryanne's licensing photo remained pulled up beside her hospital ID scan. She kept returning to the way Maryanne's name had vanished from the logs, the way her apartment had been cleaned out, the absence of a missing persons report. Every inch of it felt intentional, like threads had been snipped one by one, not frayed naturally. Why was Maryanne's last shift scrubbed? What did she know? And was Breyer involved? Sarah began the morning with a lead she hoped would add depth to Maryanne's backstory, family, next of kin, someone who could speak to who she was outside the hospital corridors. She requested Maryanne's licensing application from the State Medical Board. It listed no emergency contact. A check through the Department of Health. Records revealed that both of her parents had died in a car accident in 1974, 7 years before her disappearance. Maryanne was 21 then, a second-year med student. There were no siblings on file, no surviving relatives listed on her tax returns. The apartment lease hadn't included a cosigner. She had left behind no one, at least. Not officially. Sarah stared at the blank line where next of kin should have been. Even in death, Maryanne was her own island. The realization weighed heavier than expected, not just because it complicated things, but because it meant no one had even been looking for her. By midday, Sarah was back at the city archives facility. In the long basement room filled with rolling metal shelves and yellowed folders stacked inside sagging boxes. She had requested St. Armand's shift records for June and July of 1981. The clerk, a tall man in his 60s named Ron, pushed the card in front of her with an apologetic shrug. "You're not going to like this," he said, setting a water-damaged carton on the table. "We lost a chunk of these back in '86, mold outbreak. HVAC flooded this room, took out 3 entire cabinets." Sarah flipped open the box. As promised, the folders were warped and brittle. Several were stuck together, their contents illegible. The 2 weeks following Maryanne's disappearance were missing entirely. "Nothing digital? Nothing," Ron said. "It was all analog back then." Adnan didn't start scanning until '88. Sarah held up one folder that had somehow escaped damage. The roster for July 5th to 12th was mostly intact, but Maryanne's name was absent. Whoever was in charge of scheduling had simply moved on. It was as if she had never been there to begin with. As she packed to leave, Ron hesitated. "You're the one looking into that doctor, right? The one from the drawer?" Sarah nodded. "Maryanne Holt." He scratched his head. "Hang on a sec." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a thinner folder marked Unsorted Depth Audit Backups. "These were my backups. I used to keep copies. Was paranoid about the originals getting ruined." Sarah opened the file. Inside were several stapled sheets from the A rotation schedules. The paper was cleaner than the others, slightly off-white. Handwritten, not typed. June 29, 1981, Holt M. Night, Room 3, June 29, 1981. Attending, Breyer, S., initialed SB. There it was, a direct connection. 2 patients under Holt's care that night were assigned to Dr. Samuel Breyer. His initials appeared beside both cases. One of the patients had been admitted under a special intake code, FTR82. "What's that code?" she asked Ron. He frowned. "That's not standard auriage. Might have been part of a pilot or research intake." Sarah copied the page and folded it into her binder. She didn't say anything more, but she was already planning the next visit. Dr. Samuel Breyer lived alone in a high-rise condominium near Volunteer Park. His assistant answered the door and escorted Sarah to the study. The room smelled faintly of polish and leather. Books lined every wall, most medical, a few philosophical. Breyer himself stood near the window, a tall, well-kept man in his 70s with silvery hair and a confident stillness. "Detective Whitmore," he said warmly, "please." "Sit," she declined. "I'm investigating a death. A body was recovered at the old St. Armand site." He nodded, not surprised. "I heard something on the radio." "You think I'm connected?" "You were chief of internal medicine in 1981. "I was," he said evenly, "but that was a long time ago." "Do you remember Dr. Maryanne Holt?" He smiled faintly, but there was something mechanical in the movement. "The name rings a bell. Resident, wasn't she?" "Attending, actually. She disappeared during a night shift on June 29, 1981. Her remains were found sealed in a drawer in the hospital morgue." His face didn't change. "I see," he said. "How tragic. You were assigned to 2 of her patients that night. Your initials appear on the intake sheets." "That's not unusual. I oversaw many residents." He waved one hand lightly. "But I don't recall any specific incident." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Nothing at all?" "No," he said, still composed. "But I'll help however I can." Her gut told her he already knew what she was going to ask long before she walked in. After the interview, Sarah returned to her office and started digging deeper into Breyer's career. His name appeared in 5 medical journals between 1982 and 1995. After St. Armand closed, he took a temporary fellowship in Chicago, then joined a private healthcare board and later chaired a nonprofit focused on innovation and institutional ethics. His career, far from being stalled by St. Armand's decline, had surged forward. She searched public financial disclosures. Breyer had served on the boards of 3 pharmaceutical companies during the early 90s. Each one had ties to experimental treatments and accelerated clinical trials. Her notes began to fan outward like a web. St. Armand's internal funding, missing shift logs, mysterious intake codes, and now a doctor who had quietly risen in prominence despite being linked to a vanished colleague. She felt herself tightening around a truth she couldn't name yet, but it was close. In the finance archives of St. Armand, Sarah found a curious payout. On June 26, 1981, 3 days before Maryanne's last shift, a bonus of $7,000 had been issued to Everett Mallory, morgue supervisor. It had been logged under hazard duty, allocation, hazard pay, but no incident report accompanied it. No lab spill, no equipment malfunction, no explanation. She looked up his name. He had left the hospital abruptly in 1982. No forwarding address, no employment history since. But that wasn't her only lead. She arranged to speak with another former nurse, Sue Ramos, now working as an administrator in a small hospice center outside Tacoma. They met in a quiet break room. Sue was in her early 60s, her posture guarded. "I remember Maryanne," she said after a long pause. "We weren't close, but people noticed her." "In what way?" Sue hesitated, then looked away. She was always following up on cases, writing things down, asking questions. Sarah waited. She wasn't wrong to do it, but people didn't like it. You're not supposed to push too hard in a place like that, especially when you're new. Sarah's voice was quiet. "Did she ever say she felt unsafe?" "She never said it," Sue replied, "but you could see it." She started carrying her bag with her, even to the lounge. She didn't leave notes on shared clipboards. Everything went straight into her pocket. "Why do you think she disappeared?" Sue swallowed. "Maryanne cared too much. That was her mistake." Sarah sat in her car outside the hospice center for a full 5 minutes before going in. She wasn't sure how Sue Ramos would react to another visit, especially with what she now carried in her folder. She didn't want to use it, but she knew. From years of homicide, work that guilt could be a more powerful force than any threat. Sue greeted her at the side entrance with the same guarded stiffness. Her short salt and pepper hair was pulled back tightly, and she wore a visitor's badge clipped to her collar. "I already told you everything I know," she said softly, glancing at the folder in Sarah's hand. Sarah followed her into the break room. Again, same place, same dim overhead light. She set the folder on the table but didn't open it right away. "I don't think you did," Sarah said calmly. "Not all of it." Sue looked away, arms crossed. Sarah gently opened the folder and slid a single photo across the table. Maryanne's skeletal remains, partially wrapped in decayed linens, taken during recovery from the morgue drawer. No gore, just the unmistakable outline of a woman folded where she didn't belong. Sue's face changed instantly. Her hand went to her mouth, her breath catching. "She was your friend," Sarah said. "You knew something happened, and you've carried it this long." Sue's eyes welled, and she blinked hard. "You can't put that in front of me and expect me to." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I lied that first time. I didn't want to be involved again. Again." That was the word Sarah had been waiting for. They sat in silence for a long moment. Sue finally spoke, voice shaking. "That night, June 29th, I was on the late rotation. I had just finished rounds when I saw Maryanne go down the hallway toward Dr. Breyer's office. It was nearly midnight." Sarah didn't interrupt. "I knew." She'd been pushing hard, asking questions about patient charts. Some of the cases coming in weren't adding up. Vital signs missing. Medications recorded that weren't administered. She thought someone was falsifying data. I told her to be careful. "Did she go into his office?" "She did. She didn't come out." Sue swallowed. "I went down there maybe 20 minutes later. I didn't see her, but I heard them through the wall. She was yelling at him. I couldn't hear the words, just the tone. Angry, accusatory. And then it got quiet. What did you do?" "I left," Sue whispered. "I didn't want to be part of it. You don't understand. Breyer had power. He could bury people. She was going after something too big." Sarah studied her face. "You didn't see her again after that?" "No," Sue said, shaking her head. "Next day, she wasn't on shift. Week after, the hospital said she was on leave. And you didn't speak up." "I was afraid," Sue said quietly. "We all were." Sarah sat back, giving her space. "Was that the last time you interacted with her?" Sue hesitated again, then opened her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and faded. It was a blank envelope, yellowing with age. No markings, no name. "She gave me this the week before," Sue said. "Told me to keep it safe. Said if something happened to her, someone had to come forward." Sarah leaned forward. "Where is it?" "I burned it. I got scared after she disappeared. I told myself I was protecting myself, but I knew what I was really doing." Sarah was quiet. Sarah went back to her desk and pulled Everett Mullery's file. The morgue supervisor had vanished in 1985, 2 weeks before St. Armand was formally shut down. He'd taken early retirement, no forwarding address. The hospital listed him as administratively off-boarded, but Sarah found no pension records, no insurance filings, no tax forms under his name. After that year, she ran a national search for aliases and came up with a match. Evan Marsh, Spokane, Washington, a man of the same age, same height, same partial Social Security number. He owned a small one-bedroom house registered under a land trust and paid property taxes in cash. Sarah drove out 2 days later, staying in an unmarked city rental. She confirmed visually same man, aged and thinner, but unmistakable. He had grown a full beard and dyed his hair. but his gait matched the video from 1982 hospital security footage. Over the next 3 days, Sarah set up a quiet surveillance schedule. Mallory kept to himself. Every other morning, he left early, walked to a nearby credit union, and made small cash withdrawals, no more than a few hundred at a time. He bought groceries in cash, drove an unregistered 1992 pickup truck. The most curious detail came on the third day. He drove to a remote storage facility outside the city, entered using a key card registered under the name Russell Grant, and stayed inside Unit 103 for nearly 40 minutes. When he emerged, he was empty-handed. Sarah pulled the logbook later. He'd been visiting the same unit twice a month for nearly a decade. She pulled records for Unit 103's registration, leased under a fabricated business name linked to a defunct healthcare courier company. The address used an abandoned warehouse once owned by a subsidiary of St. Armand's former parent group. It was enough to move. Sarah waited outside his house the next morning. When he stepped outside with his coat and keys, she approached. "Everett." "Mallory," she said calmly. He froze. "You're not in trouble yet, but I need you to come with me." She didn't cuff him, just opened the car door and waited. He got in without a word. At the precinct, she brought him to a small interview room. Her tone stayed level. "We found payment records. A lump sum issued to you 3 days before Dr. Maryanne Holt's final shift. $7,000, unusual for a morgue tech." He said nothing. "We also know you were in the building when she disappeared. That you were responsible for sealing the cadaver drawers before the shutdown." Still nothing. His fingers fidgeted against the table edge. Sarah leaned in. "There's a drawer in St. Armand that was marked hazard cleared, the same drawer. We found her in. You signed off on it." His lips parted just slightly. She kept her voice calm. "I'm not here to scare you, Mr. Mallory. I want the truth. Because whatever you're still running from after all these years, it's not going to stay hidden." His hand trembled slightly. He looked up at her. She saw it, not guilt, but fear. It was just after sunrise when Sarah pulled into the gravel lot behind Riverside Storage in Spokane. A deputy U.S. Marshal accompanied her, standing quietly while she reviewed the signed warrant. It hadn't taken long between Mallory's alias, the phony lease, and the connection to a defunct hospital subsidiary. The paper trail had been enough to justify a search. The unit in question, 103, looked like every other rusted door on the row. But as the lock clattered open and the door groaned upward, Sarah felt her pulse thicken. Inside, rows of battered bankers' boxes were stacked on plastic shelves. A fan unit stood in one corner, long unplugged. Dust coated everything, but there was no sign of water damage or tampering. Most of the labels were handwritten. Farm. Docs 1980. St. Armand staff files, ledgers, X-ray transcripts. She approached slowly. The temperature inside was cool but stale. She opened the first box. Patient records, full names, diagnoses, medication sheets, most handwritten. These weren't copies. These were originals. Not one of them bore a digital ID tag. Sarah picked up another folder labeled 1979 to 1981 critical mortality cases. Dozens of names, some marked with black ink check marks, others red X's. At the very bottom was an unmarked envelope. She pulled it out with gloved fingers. The handwriting inside made her stop cold. The folder inside the envelope was thin, almost brittle with age. On the front, incident reports, unfiled. Each page was a case summary, neatly typed on yellowing paper, unsigned, but stamped with hospital notations. Some had red slips attached. Patient declined participation. No Form 3C on file. The patients listed had all died within 48 hours of declining treatment participation. Sarah paged through slowly, her eyes catching on familiar names. The sixth entry hit like a blow to the chest. Patient, Emily Whitmore. Date of admission, the 2nd of August 1980. Primary physician, S. Breyer. Outcome: cardiac arrest following observation. Consent to trial: declined. Her mother. Sarah stood still for a long moment, reading the lines over again. She remembered her mother's sudden passing. She had always been told it was a random, tragic heart failure during a routine observation stay. She was told there had been no complications, no warning. Now here she was, listed in a secret incident report alongside half a dozen others who had refused trial participation and died shortly thereafter. Sarah closed the folder slowly. Her breath was shallow but steady. This was personal. In a separate box, buried beneath a stack of personnel timesheets, Sarah found a soft green notebook with a cracked spine. On the inside cover, in neat handwriting, M.H. She flipped through page after page of Maryanne Holt's notes, each entry written and concise. Script: June 12th. Patient refused StudyMed, later transferred under different ID. SB initials appear on daily entries. Records edited. No signatures from patient. No consent forms. None on file. HR not responding. Sarah stared at the notebook, the pieces finally fitting together with eerie clarity. Maryanne hadn't just stumbled across medical errors. She had documented a pattern, a system, a quiet mechanism for eliminating liability. Patients who didn't consent to experimental protocols died soon after, and their objections vanished from the records. She was about to expose it and was silenced. Her blood boiled, but she knew she needed more evidence to take down those responsible. Back at the Spokane precinct, Everett Mallory sat quietly in the interview room. His fingers trembled slightly. Against the tabletop, his eyes flicking toward the mirror, as if he could sense the weight pressing in from behind it. Sarah entered with a box in her hands. No introductions. She sat, removed Maryanne's notebook, and laid it down. I went through the storage unit, she said. Mallory didn't respond. You saved everything, she said calmly. I think part of you always expected this moment. Still nothing. She opened the incident folder next. There's no mistake anymore. I have the reports, the ledgers, the documents you were told to store, the ones that were supposed to be shredded. He still didn't speak. I also found the drawer logs and the payout dated 3 days before Maryanne vanished. That made. His eyes flick upward, only for a moment. Sarah leaned forward. What happened that day? Start talking. Finally, Mallory exhaled, long and slow, like letting go of a breath he'd been holding for decades. I didn't know what was in the drawer, he said quietly. I swear to you I didn't. Sarah waited. I was told to seal it. That's all. Drawer 18. The order came from upstairs, operations. They said it was already cleared. Biohazard. He rubbed his face with both hands. I thought it was a stillborn. Maybe some waste from surgery. That's what they told me. Do your job, Everett. Don't ask questions. So I did. You signed off. He nodded barely. I signed off because they paid me more than usual. It wasn't hush money, not outright. Just a hazard bonus, a one-time payout. Sarah stopped the interrogation. She knew Mallory still wasn't telling the truth. But he would, eventually. She'd make sure of it. By evening, Mallory had been formally detained under suspicion of conspiracy to destroy public records, obstruction of justice, and tampering with death certificates. Sarah wasn't sure how much would stick, but it was enough to hold him, and more importantly, enough to subpoena additional parties. Back at her desk, she scanned through Breyer's name again, now circled in red on her whiteboard. He dodged every question, parried every probe, but the initials were on Maryanne's notes. His name was on her mother's incident report, and he had overseen the patient roster the night Maryanne vanished. Sarah picked up the phone and dialed. I need to file for a second warrant, she said. This time for Dr. Samuel Breyer. She hung up and stared at Maryanne's photo again, the confident young woman with a cautious smile and direct eyes. This wasn't just about a cold case anymore. It was about every name in that folder. And it was time to pull the next thread. Sarah started with the names in Maryanne's notebook, the ones marked with X's, former patients of St. Armand who had reportedly declined treatment or gone into unexplained decline after routine procedures. Most had died in the early 80s, but she could still track their families. The first was Ruth Landry, daughter of Carl Landry, a retired postman who died after routine observation for vertigo. Ruth lived in a quiet duplex in Clackamas and didn't hesitate to talk. I remember he said no to something, she recalled. Some drug they wanted to try. He didn't like the sound of it. Said the doctor got tense when he refused. Sarah asked for the records. They never sent them, Ruth said. We asked for months. They said they were misplaced. We eventually gave up. Next came the son of Teresa Aguilar, who died in 1981 of complications from mild pneumonia. He said a similar thing. They pressured her into signing something, he said. Then she got worse. We couldn't get her out. In all, Sarah spoke to 5 families. Each one described an escalating pattern, aggressive treatment suggestions, mounting pressure to participate in special care, and then sudden deterioration. Records missing, autopsy requests denied, all under the oversight of the same attending physician, Dr. Samuel Breyer. That evening, Sarah received an email from an encrypted address. No reply, burnmail.org. I was an intern at St. Armand in 1981. I know what you're working on. He was running something off the books. We all knew it, but said nothing. I saved one memo. Attached was a scan, grainy but legible. To S. Breyer, from Arkendall. Subject, case study cohorts. 3rd round begins this week. Initial subjects responded poorly to prior compound. I've logged retractions under the June intake ledger. Recommend expanding sample set. Include high-risk patients lacking legal representation, especially elderly and indigent. Proceed under compensated discretion. Sarah read the memo twice, bile rising in her throat. It was a paper trail of moral collapse. The phrases "no representation" and "compensated discretion" were thin veils over something darker. Experimentation on vulnerable patients, unconsented trials, a private study masked as routine care. Breyer hadn't just overseen unethical conduct. He'd signed off on it. At the archives of Oregon Health and Science University, where Maryanne had studied and later lectured part-time, Sarah found her academic file, a few routine student evaluations, some peer reviews. But one entry stood out. A scheduled ethics review meeting dated June 30, 1981, one day after Maryanne's last known shift. The topic: data irregularities and non-consensual medication usage among geriatric inpatients at St. Armand Medical Center. The meeting had been canceled, no reschedule, but the timing was damning. Maryanne had planned to report the malpractice, and someone made sure she never got the chance. By late afternoon, Sarah returned to Seattle. She intended to question Breyer directly. She had enough circumstantial evidence to press him, even without a formal warrant yet. She arrived at his condominium, same as before, but the concierge at the desk looked nervous when she asked. Dr. Breyer left in a rush this morning, he said. Took 2 suitcases, didn't leave a return time. Sarah took the elevator up. Anyway, his unit was empty, drawers left open, closet doors ajar. The desk had been cleared of files. Even his framed certificates were missing from the walls. But the computer was still there, unplugged and boxed. She radioed it in. Whitmore requesting alert. Suspect Dr. Samuel Breyer is attempting to flee jurisdiction. Possible destruction of evidence. Need eyes on highways and local airports. 20 minutes later, a patrol officer near SeaTac reported a vehicle matching Breyer's heading southbound on I-5, well above the speed limit. Sarah jumped into her cruiser and joined the pursuit. The black Lexus veered between cars with erratic speed. Patrol units flanked both sides, sirens blazing. Sarah kept her distance, watching from the rear with the dash cam rolling. She recognized the silhouette behind the wheel. No passenger. Breyer exited near South Center, blew through a red light, and kept going. His tires clipped the curb of a turning lane, and he swerved back onto the road just as a construction barrier came into view. Too fast, Sarah muttered under her breath. The Lexus struck the outer curb and skidded sideways. The rear wheels lost traction, and the car flipped once, then landed on its side, scraping along the asphalt before grinding to a stop. Officers swarmed in. Breyer tried to crawl through the shattered passenger side, face bloodied and hands trembling. He made it halfway out before an officer pinned him to the pavement. Sarah arrived seconds later. Inside the wrecked car, she found a briefcase. Inside, a burner phone, several printed documents, and a flash drive. One paper caught her eye, a bank ledger listing offshore transactions between 1981 and 1984. The deposits were substantial. The senders, pharmaceutical subsidiaries linked to experimental compound testing. Another folder contained faded letters. Correspondences with Clarion Biomedical, a now defunct research group notorious for circumventing medical ethics boards during its brief operation in the early 80s. It was over. Back at the station, Sarah laid out the evidence on the table. Maryanne's notes, the anonymous memo, the offshore statements, and the email chains recovered from Breyer's flash drive. The DIA approved a warrant by midnight. Breyer, still in a hospital gown with dried blood at his temple, sat in a holding room with two deputies flanking him. When Sarah entered, he didn't lift his head. "You're being charged with medical fraud, conspiracy, and involuntary manslaughter," she said. "Additional charges pending review of your financial ties." He raised his eyes, tired, flat. Sarah waited. He said nothing. Then, finally, he whispered, she was going to ruin everything. Not an apology, not a denial, just that. Sarah turned and walked out. But she didn't feel victory. She felt the full weight of 17 years of silence cracked open by a woman who never got to speak for herself. The interview room was cold. Mallory sat alone, staring at the table with fingers folded tightly. A legal aid attorney sat beside him. Nervous, young, quiet. Sarah entered with a court recorder and a signed agreement in hand. Reduced sentencing in exchange for a full confession and cooperation. "This is your chance," she said. "Tell the truth, all of it." Mallory didn't speak right away, but eventually he nodded. The words came slowly, like something he hadn't said aloud, not even to himself. "It was Breyer," he began. "That night, after the confrontation, he came down to the morgue, said Maryanne had caused a scene, said she was unraveling, that she needed calming down." Sarah remained still. "He handed me a vial of midazolam and a syringe. Told me to settle her down until he could figure things out. I didn't ask questions. I just followed orders." He exhaled, visibly shaking now. "She was unconscious in under 2 minutes. And then?" Sarah asked. "I wheeled her down to the morgue. He told me which drawer. Number 18. Told me to put her in there. Said it was just temporary, that she'd wake up and be reassigned." Sarah leaned forward, but she didn't wake up. Mallory nodded, eyes watery. "I checked the next morning. She was dead. And he said we couldn't go back, that the drawer had to stay sealed." According to Mallory, the timing was perfect for them, at least. Shortly after, the hospital shut down several sections due to an asbestos contamination warning. Maintenance cleared the wing of staff and sealed it off for safety reasons. The morgue went quiet, unused, untouched. "Breyer said we'd use the closure as cover," Mallory said. "Told me to handle it. I changed the morgue logs, marked the drawer as containing medical waste that had been cleared. No one double-checked." He stared at his hands. "I added a seal to the drawer, bolted it shut, told the others it had been decontaminated and logged. Nobody questioned it. Everyone was trying to get out of there. Sarah felt a deep chill move through her. "You knew she was in there," she said. He nodded slowly. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my fault, that I didn't mean for her to die, that I was just doing what I was told. But every year, it got heavier." He looked up at her. "I thought maybe the building would be torn down. Maybe they'd never find her. But part of me knew it was just a matter of time." The press conference was held at City Hall 2 days later. A row of microphones lined the dais, with local media and national outlets gathered in force. Behind the podium stood the district attorney, the mayor, and Sarah's captain. Sarah remained in the back of the room, arms folded, watching quietly. As the DA took the mic, "After 16 years, we can finally begin to speak the truth," he began. Dr. Maryanne Holt, who was previously considered a missing person, has now been identified as the victim of a medical conspiracy and homicide. Her death was covered up in connection with unauthorized human experimentation conducted under the guise of legitimate patient care at St. Armand Medical Center. Gasps echoed through the room. "We are now pursuing formal charges against multiple individuals involved, including Dr. Samuel Breyer, who is currently in custody. Investigations are ongoing." Sarah said nothing, her eyes fixed on the photo now projected behind the speakers. Maryanne Holt in her white coat, smiling confidently on the hospital steps. She had been buried not just in a morgue drawer, but in silence, in inaction, in bureaucracy. But not anymore. It started with quiet resignations. 3 days after Breyer's arrest, the Medical Review Board issued a public statement acknowledging that procedural oversights and regulatory failures contributed to a culture of unmonitored research practices at St. Armand Medical Center between 1978 and 1984. Buried in the language was a list of former board members and research liaisons. Names that now appeared in Breyer's archived correspondences and internal memos. 2. Former board members stepped down from active teaching roles at private universities. Another was subpoenaed for testimony regarding funding links between St. Armand and Clarion Biomedical. By the end of the week, 3 hospitals in the region voluntarily reopened their own ethics reviews, scanning for patterns similar to those that had emerged from Maryanne's notes. The city's largest university hospital removed Breyer's name from their donor wall. What once seemed buried in an outdated archive had triggered the unraveling of an entire professional network. Sarah found herself at a community center auditorium. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, standing before a gathering of family she had come to know by name: Ruth Landry, Miguel Aguilar, Annette Shields. Each had brought faded records and photocopied death certificates. Many had never questioned what happened to their loved ones until now. The hall buzzed with quiet grief and new anger. A civil rights attorney named Leah Brown addressed them first, outlining the structure of the class action suit: wrongful death, conspiracy to defraud, institutional negligence. Then she introduced Sarah. She hadn't planned to speak, but they turned to her expectantly. She stepped forward. "I didn't know how deep this would go when we found her," she began. "But I want you to know we didn't stop. Maryanne Holt died trying to expose what happened. This case isn't just hers anymore. It's yours too." Afterward, several family members approached her. "Thank you," Ruth whispered, clutching Sarah's hand. "You gave us something to fight with." The sentencing hearing came 3 weeks later. The courtroom was quieter this time. Fewer cameras, no opening statements, just the gavel, the victim's family seated in heavy silence, and the 2 men in suits seated far apart. Mallory in subdued gray, Breyer in navy blue, thinner now. Judge Palmer addressed the court, his tone measured but resolute. "To Mr. Everett Mallory," he said, "you are found guilty of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and criminal negligence contributing to involuntary manslaughter. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in state prison with eligibility." For parole in 7. The court notes your cooperation in revealing the broader conspiracy. Mallory closed his eyes but said nothing. Sarah didn't look at him. To Dr. Samuel Breyer, the judge continued, "You are found guilty of conspiracy to commit medical fraud, multiple counts of unauthorized human experimentation, and second-degree murder in the death of Dr. Maryanne Holt. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Breyer lifted his eyes toward the bench. For the first time since his arrest, his expression faltered. Not remorse, not confusion, just the realization that the system he once manipulated had turned at last against him. No applause followed. No gasp, only the sound of the gavel striking wood and the slow shuffle of chairs as the courtroom began to empty. 2 weeks later, Sarah returned to the construction site where it had all begun. The old hospital was gone now, reduced to a flattened lot of damp soil and caution tape. Excavators sat still under the gray sky. She stood under her umbrella, staring out across the space. This was where Maryanne had worked, where she had fought, recorded, resisted. This was where her own mother had died. For a long time, Sarah said nothing. She let the silence stretch, broken only by the wind shifting through the chain-link fence and the soft tap of rain against gravel. She thought of the years that had passed, of all the unanswered questions, the quiet wrongs that had never made. The news. She thought of Maryanne, alone in that cold drawer, her notes unfinished, of her mother in that bed, slowly fading after saying no to a treatment no one had explained. The city would build something new here. Another name, another purpose. But Sarah would remember what had come before, the pain buried beneath paperwork, the truths that nearly stayed hidden, and the women who never stopped resisting, whether anyone noticed or not. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "May you rest in peace."